There is a clock ticking right now inside Russia, and it is not the one Moscow wants the world to hear. It is not the countdown on Kremlin missile tests. It is not the timer on another battlefield offensive. It is the sound of something breaking beneath Vladimir Putin's feet, the quiet, escalating collapse of the one thing his war machine has always depended on. Not soldiers, not oil revenue, not sanctions evasion, public consent. And in the last 72 hours, that consent has begun to fracture in ways the Kremlin has spent 26 years engineering to prevent. Rare protests in Moscow and St. Petersburg, pro-Kremlin influencers turning against him on camera. A famous loyalist hospitalized in a psychiatric ward after publicly breaking with Putin. 25 arrests in a single weekend for protesting digital restrictions. A pro-Kremlin newspaper, publishing an editorial accusing the government of treating Russians like small children. This is not a mood. This is a threshold. And what is happening inside Russia right now is not a story about grumbling citizens. It is a case study in why the stable authoritarian assumption about Putin's Russia was always going to fail. And it is failing on a timeline nobody in Washington, Brussels, or Kyiv was prepared for. Let us start with what actually happened, because the details matter, and the details are what the mainstream headlines are missing. On March 29, 2026, activists across 17 Russian regions submitted applications to hold public rallies. The date was not accidental. It was a symbolic reference to Article 29 of the Russian Constitution, the article that guarantees freedom of thought and speech. Every single application was denied. Some were initially approved, then rescinded. The official reason given by Moscow authorities was COVID restrictions. Read that again. COVID restrictions in 2026. Restrictions that do not somehow apply to government-approved rallies, military parades, or state-organized concerts. The activists went ahead anyway. According to the independent monitoring group OVD Info, at least 25 people were arrested across Russia on Sunday, March 29th, 18 of them in Moscow alone. Detentions continued in the days that followed. In St. Petersburg, plainclothes officers were photographed by SOPA Images and Reuters questioning demonstrators on the street. In Yakutsk in Siberia, a 27-year-old taxi driver named Alexei Popov, who had received initial permission to hold a rally, saw that permission withdrawn on the grounds, and this is the actual language of the refusal letter, that his event might attract considerable attention from destructive individuals. Popov was detained on Saturday and released on Monday. His alleged crime was disobeying police, a charge he disputes. That was not a casual weekend of unrest. That was the first coordinated cross-regional call for public protest inside the Russian Federation since the anti-mobilization demonstrations of September 2022. And this time, the trigger was not conscription. It was the internet. Now step back and look at the bigger picture, because this is where it gets more dangerous for the Kremlin. For years, Western analysts have operated on a single dominant assumption. That assumption goes like this: Vladimir Putin can survive any battlefield setback, any sanctions regime, any diplomatic isolation, so long as he maintains information control at home. Cut off independent media, saturate state television, criminalize dissent, and the Russian public, conditioned by decades of imperial passivity, KGB inheritance, and 1990s trauma, will absorb almost any hardship. That was the assumption. That was the strategic wager. And for 4 years of full-scale war in Ukraine, that assumption held. It held through mobilization. It held through the Prigozhin mutiny. It held through the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Russian men on the battlefield. It held through the near-total collapse of the pre-war Russian middle class abroad. And it held because the Kremlin believed, correctly, for a time, that if it kept Russians online, but only on approved platforms, it could manage the narrative indefinitely. That assumption is now failing, and it is failing not because of Ukrainian drone strikes or Western sanctions or opposition organizing. It is failing because the Kremlin itself decided to break its own bargain with its own population. Here is what changed. Beginning in the fall of 2025 and accelerating through the first quarter of 2026, Russian authorities began imposing what Chatham House and the Jamestown Foundation have both documented as sweeping, unprecedented mobile internet shutdowns. According to CNN reporting from March 21, 2026, residents of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and dozens of other Russian cities began finding their smartphones effectively dumbed down, mobile data cut for hours, sometimes days at a time. Human Rights Watch documented that these were not isolated technical failures. They were deliberate, region-by-region shutdowns imposed under vague security justifications. Then, on March 31, 2026, the New York Times reported that Moscow planned to fully block Telegram, the single most used messaging application in the Russian Federation, with more than 80 million domestic users, starting April 1st. WhatsApp had already been throttled. Foreign VPN services were being aggressively blocked, and in their place, the Kremlin began pushing a new state-controlled messaging platform called Max, an application that independent security researchers and Russian opposition figures have described as a mass surveillance tool. Think about that for a second. The Kremlin, which has spent a decade telling Russians that the internet is a tool of Western subversion, has now decided that even the tightly monitored Russian internet is too dangerous to permit. And it made that decision precisely at the moment when its citizens are dealing with three simultaneous economic shocks that require more than anything else: communication. That is the first move in the evidence ladder. Here is the second. The economic picture inside Russia in 2026 is not the one Moscow's official statistics describe. The Wall Street Journal's editorial page reported that in the first 4 months of 2026 alone, the Russian federal budget deficit reached 5.87 trillion rubles. Currency printing presses, in the journal's phrase, are running at full speed. El País, citing multiple Russian economists in May 2026, reported that inflation has become, quote, the #1 problem inside Russia, eroding what had been Putin's immense post-invasion popularity. The International Institute for Strategic Studies published a research paper in May 2026 warning of an approaching crisis in Russia's political economy, with industrial and manpower constraints forcing the Kremlin toward a decision it has spent 4 years avoiding: whether to forcibly mobilize the entire economy and society for prolonged war. The Netherlands Military Intelligence and Security Service, the MIVD, concluded in a 2026 report that Russia is already laying the groundwork for confrontation with NATO, even as its domestic economic foundations weaken. RAND published commentary in February 2026, noting that Russia's own labor minister has warned Putin the country will face a shortage of 2.4 million workers by 2030. Some independent estimates place the figure far higher. And on top of the inflation, on top of the labor shortage, on top of the ruble instability, there is the fuel crisis. Ukrainian long-range drone strikes have systematically dismantled Russian refinery capacity throughout 2025 and into 2026. According to Reuters reporting cited by Deutsche Welle, 16 Russian refineries were struck in May of 2026 alone. Gasoline production dropped by 25%. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies documented in June 2026 that gasoline shortages are now a compounding factor in Russia's economic struggles, not just a battlefield inconvenience. In occupied Ukrainian territory, according to the Institute for the Study of War, fuel shortages have become acute. Inside Russia proper, drivers in dozens of regions have reported waiting hours at pumps or being turned away entirely. The details matter. And the details, taken together, describe something the Kremlin's state television will not name: a wartime society running out of the material and psychological reserves it needs to keep absorbing punishment quietly. Now, here is where mainstream Western framing gets this story wrong and where the deeper strategic reality begins to emerge. The prevailing analysis in most Western capitals still treats Russian domestic discontent as marginal. The reasoning goes something like this. Even if Russians are unhappy, the Kremlin's repression apparatus is too developed to permit meaningful protest, so the unhappiness is politically inert. That analysis is not wrong on the mechanics of repression. It is wrong on what the current wave of discontent actually represents. Because the March 2026 protests are not the story. The people around the protests are the story. Consider who is now criticizing the government. Anastasia Kashevarova, a pro-Kremlin journalist, someone who has spent years defending the regime, wrote on Telegram last week that the wall of mistrust and misunderstanding between the people and the government is growing, and warned that public revolt was the fastest way to destroy Russia. Read that carefully. She was not calling for revolt. She was warning the Kremlin that revolt is now on the horizon of what is thinkable. Victoria Bonya, a Russian fitness and lifestyle blogger with nearly 13 million Instagram followers, a figure entirely apolitical by design, publicly questioned in a recent video whether Vladimir Putin was even aware of what was happening in his own country. Moskovsky Komsomolets, a mainstream Russian newspaper, not an opposition outlet, published an editorial complaining that the number of meaningless bans per capita is already off the charts and asking whether authorities consider us to be small children. And Ilya Remeslo, a well-known, long-standing Kremlin loyalist, turned against Putin publicly, citing the strangling of internet and media freedoms as evidence the Russian leader had lost his grip on reality. Within 24 hours, according to NBC News, Remeslo was hospitalized in a psychiatric facility. That was not a casual sequence of events. That was a signal. When the loyalists start defecting, when apolitical influencers start asking whether the president knows what is happening in his own country, when pro-Kremlin newspapers start writing that the government is treating the population like children, the regime is no longer managing dissent from the outside. It is managing dissent from the inside. And the tool it is reaching for, psychiatric hospitalization of a critic, is the Soviet-era instrument. That is not a modernization tactic. That is a regression tactic. It is what a system reaches for when its more sophisticated tools have already failed. Now step back and consider what this means strategically, because this is where the pattern becomes visible. The Putin system has always rested on what political scientists describe as an implicit social contract, political passivity in exchange for stability and modest prosperity. Russians would not challenge the regime, and in return, the regime would deliver rising incomes, functional infrastructure, and freedom in the private sphere, including, crucially, freedom online. The war in Ukraine broke the prosperity side of that contract. Sanctions accelerated the break, but the Kremlin bought itself time by ramping up defense sector spending, which flooded certain regions with wartime wages and masked the underlying damage. That buffer is now running out. The IISS analysis, the WSJ analysis, and the El País reporting all converge on the same conclusion. War-driven Russian economic growth is losing momentum, financial reserves are shrinking, and sanctions pressure is tightening faster than the Kremlin can compensate. And at precisely that moment, the moment when the regime most needs its citizens to remain passive, it has chosen to break the second half of the social contract. It has taken away the internet. It has taken away Telegram. It has imposed a surveillance app. It has cut mobile data in the country's largest cities. It has done, in other words, the one thing guaranteed to make ordinary, previously apolitical Russians angry. Angry not about the war, which many have been trained to tolerate, but about their own daily lives. This is where it gets more dangerous for Moscow, because a population that will accept battlefield casualties will not necessarily accept being unable to call a taxi, run a small business, transfer money, or reach a doctor. The Jamestown Foundation documented in early 2026 that Russian internet restrictions are already undermining the domestic economy. Small businesses cannot process payments, delivery services cannot route drivers, and entire sectors dependent on mobile connectivity are grinding down. That is not an ideological grievance. That is a material one. And material grievances are historically the ones that unseat authoritarian systems, not ideological ones. Now consider what the Kremlin is doing about it. According to Meduza's reporting from May 22, 2026, Vladimir Putin's approval rating fell to its lowest point in a year in mid-May 2026. According to independent analysis published by Nest Center, VTSIOM, the state polling agency, showed Putin's approval sliding from 74% in February to 65.6% by April 2026, with his trust rating falling from 78% to 71% over the same window. VTIOM's response was not to reassure the public. It was to change the methodology of its own polling to stop the decline from being visible. That is not the behavior of a confident regime. That is the behavior of a regime that has begun to fear its own numbers. Here is where it gets more dangerous still, and here is the piece the mainstream analysis is missing entirely. The Kremlin has spent decades cultivating a very specific external narrative that Russia is an internally cohesive, historically resilient, spiritually unified civilization capable of absorbing punishment no Western society could withstand. That narrative is not just propaganda. It is deterrence. It is the message Moscow sends to Washington and Brussels every time sanctions tighten or Ukrainian strikes reach deeper into Russian territory. You cannot break us because our people will endure anything. The moment that narrative visibly cracks, the moment protests appear in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the moment loyalists defect on camera, the moment a pro-Kremlin newspaper editorializes against the government, the deterrent value of the entire narrative collapses. And when the deterrent value collapses, the pressure calculations in Washington, Brussels, and Kyiv change. Suddenly, additional sanctions look more effective. Suddenly, longer-range strike authorizations look more justifiable. Suddenly, negotiating leverage shifts. This is the alliance logic variable the mainstream framing misses. Russian domestic unrest is not a humanitarian sidebar to the war. It is a strategic input to the war. Every additional protest in Moscow, every additional loyalist defection, every additional pro-Kremlin outlet publishing dissent, each of these events measurably weakens Putin's negotiating position, both with Kyiv and with the West. And the Kremlin knows this. That is why the response to a rally of a few hundred people in central Moscow is now the same as the response to a full-scale opposition movement. Mass arrests, plainclothes officers, psychiatric hospitalization, and the sudden simultaneous imposition of COVID-era restrictions the state stopped enforcing years ago. Now, this is not speculation, and it is not a one-off, because the pattern the Kremlin is now caught inside has a name. It is what analysts of late Soviet decline call the repression trap. The regime represses to control public opinion. The repression itself generates new grievances. Those grievances require more repression. Each cycle costs the regime more legitimacy than it purchases in control. In the Soviet case, that trap took 2 decades to close. In the current Russian case, because of the compounding pressures of war, sanctions, fuel shortages, labor collapse, and digital revolt, the same cycle appears to be closing far faster. Think about that for a second. The system that took Andropov and Gorbachev 20 years to inherit is being reconstructed by Putin in 20 months. What happens next? Here is where the escalation ladder becomes concrete. The Kremlin now faces 3 deeply unattractive options, and the interaction between them is where the next stage of this crisis will emerge. Option 1. Further tighten the digital and physical repression apparatus. Fully block Telegram, roll out mandatory max adoption, and expand the definition of extremism to cover any public criticism of internet policy. This is the direction the regime is currently trending. Its cost is that it accelerates the very defections it is meant to prevent because it forces neutral Russians into an adversarial relationship with the state. Option 2, partially retreat from the digital crackdown, restore some Telegram functionality, and reframe the mobile shutdowns as temporary security measures. This is the option pro-Kremlin voices like Anastasia Kashevarova and Moskovsky Komsomolets appear to be quietly begging the regime to consider. Its cost is that it signals weakness, the first visible Kremlin concession to domestic pressure in years, which invites more of it. Option 3, and this is the one Western analysts are most concerned about: escalate externally to distract internally. A major military move, a nuclear signaling exercise, a provocation on NATO's eastern flank, or an intensification of hybrid operations against Baltic or Polish infrastructure. Historically, authoritarian regimes facing simultaneous domestic and battlefield pressure have reached for exactly this option. The MIVD's own 2026 assessment that Russia is already laying the ground for confrontation with NATO should be read in that light. This is where the pattern the Netherlands intelligence service identified becomes not a forecast, but a description. That is not speculation. That is doctrine. The Russian military academy tradition, going back through Soviet strategic culture into imperial-era Russian statecraft, has always treated external escalation as a legitimate release valve for internal pressure. It is not a secret. It is written into Russian military strategic literature. And it is why the current wave of Russian domestic unrest is not a story about protest signs in Moscow. It is a story about what the Kremlin might feel forced to do abroad to distract from protest signs in Moscow. Here's what to watch in the next 48 to 72 hours, and in the 2 to 3 weeks beyond. Watch whether Telegram is fully blocked or whether the regime blinks. Watch whether VTIOM releases fresh polling or continues suppressing the numbers. Watch whether additional pro-Kremlin figures break with Putin publicly, and watch what happens to them within 24 hours. Watch whether protest applications in additional Russian regions are approved or denied, and watch whether the arrest counts climb. Watch whether Russian mobile connectivity in Moscow and St. Petersburg is restored or degraded further. Watch what Russian state television does not report, because in the Russian information system, silence is often the loudest indicator. And watch NATO's eastern flank, watch Belarus, watch the Baltic border. Because if the regime chooses option 3, external escalation as internal distraction, the first signs will not appear in Moscow. They will appear in Minsk, in Kaliningrad, in the airspace over Estonia and Latvia, and in the maritime approaches to Poland. The Russian public is not yet revolting in the sense of an uprising. That is not what this moment is. What this moment is the first visible crack in the wall of enforced consent that has held Putin's system together since 1999. Cracks in load-bearing walls do not close on their own. They widen. And what widens them historically is not opposition organizing. It is regime miscalculation. And the regime at this moment is miscalculating on nearly every front simultaneously. On the digital front, on the economic front, on the polling front, and on the informational front. The mainstream framing of this story will tell you that Russians grumbled about their internet and a few dozen people were arrested. That framing is not wrong. It is just small. The real story is that a system built on the assumption of infinite public passivity has just been shown on camera that its assumption is expiring. And that changes the strategic calculation in every capital that has been trying to figure out how long Putin can keep this war going. The answer, based on the last 72 hours, is not as long as Moscow needs it to. None of this means the regime collapses tomorrow. None of it means the war ends in a week. Repressive systems can survive a very long time in the repression trap. But the question is no longer whether the Kremlin's domestic foundation is stable. The question is now how the Kremlin behaves as that foundation continues to erode, and whether the pressure release valve it reaches for is internal, external, or both. Everything that happens next in this war, on the Ukrainian front, on the NATO frontier, and in Russia's own streets, will be shaped by that choice. This story is not over. It is, in a real sense, only just beginning to become visible. There will be more protests. There will be more defections. There will be more digital crackdowns. And there will, almost certainly, be attempts by the Kremlin to reroute all of that pressure outward. Every one of those moves will be tracked here in detail as it happens. If you want to understand where this war is actually going, not where the headlines say it is going, but where the underlying pressure is pushing it, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because the next few weeks are going to determine whether the Russian regime holds the line it has drawn or is forced to cross a line nobody in Moscow, Kyiv, Washington, or Brussels is prepared for. This channel will be with you every step of the way.